You were a mistake. We only wanted one child. That's what my mother told me during Thanksgiving dinner at my aunt's house 5 months ago. And it wasn't the first time they'd said that. They told me the same thing over 10 years ago, back when I had the nerve to call out the favoritism they showed toward my older brother. I was 18 at the time, and that very night they kicked me out of the house. Years later, after realizing that the child they once called a mistake has achieved more than they ever imagined, they're trying to come back into my life. But it's too late. Some support my decision and believe I was right to turn them away. Others say I'm wrong. After all, they're still my parents, the ones who gave me life, and family is family no matter what. So here's my story. And I want you to tell me, was I right to cut those ties or wrong? Hi everyone. My name is Matthew. I'm 32 years old and founder and CEO of Lynx Capital, a firm that helps mid-sized and large businesses solve complex financial problems. We fix cash flow crises, optimize investment strategies, and when necessary, we can pull a company back from the edge of bankruptcy in just a few weeks. My annual income sits comfortably in the 7-figure range. I live in a penthouse in an upscale neighborhood, commute in a sleek electric sports car, and sign deals in boardrooms where everyone wears expensive suits and speaks the language of profit. Sounds like the perfect life. But I've got a secret. Everything I have today started from something very different. A moment in my past that I'll never forget. Something that shaped who I am in a way no school or textbook ever could. To honestly tell you this story, I have to go way back, to when I was just a kid on the outside looking in, watching everyone else get the love I never did. I was born into a reasonably well-off family. My parents had stable jobs, and their income was enough for us to live comfortably. We had a 2-story house in the suburbs, and every weekend, we'd go grocery shopping together or eat out as a family. From the outside, it probably looked like I grew up in a picture-perfect home. But the truth is, not quite. I was the youngest in the family and lived in the shadow of my older brother, Andrew. Andrew was 2 years older than me, and even as a kid, he was always the center of attention. Tall, energetic, athletic, top of his class, and naturally charming. He had that presence that made people like him the moment they met him. To my parents, Andrew was the family's pride, the born-to-succeed kind of child. And me? I was different. I did well in school, my GPA was solid. I didn't play basketball or football but loved reading, building models, and volunteering in the school library. I once won 2nd place in a statewide essay competition. I even helped organize a free tutoring group for struggling students. But to my parents, none of that ever seemed worth mentioning. I still remember the day I brought home an award certificate, excited to show my mom. She glanced at it, gave a half-hearted nod, and said, "That's good, but Andrew made it to the national finals once. Keep trying. Okay?" I didn't say anything, not because I was hurt, but because I was used to it. There was even a time I overheard my mom on the phone with my aunt, her voice beaming with pride. Andrew was just born to make something of himself. As for Matthew, he's obedient, well-behaved, that's enough. I still remember those words. Somewhere along the way, I learned to choose the quiet classroom spots, the corners no one noticed at parties. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I knew I was never the one people expected anything from. Even though I had grown used to being compared, overlooked, and brushed aside, I still believed deep down that my parents loved me. Maybe not as much as they loved my brother, but I was still a part of the family. I used to think, maybe they just weren't good at showing it. Until the day I brought home my acceptance letter from the University of Michigan Business Administration program. I was 18. I waited until dinner after we'd finished eating and had just started dessert. While my dad was mid-bite into an apple, I took a deep breath and said, as calmly as I could, "I have something to share with everyone. I got accepted into Michigan." I expected smiles, a pat on the head, maybe even a "we're proud of you," but none of that happened. My mom just looked up, nodded slightly, and said flatly, "Oh, that's nice." I waited, hoping someone would ask a question, say something more. No one did. Dad kept slicing his meat. Andrew was pouring himself a drink like he hadn't heard a word. I pulled the letter out of my pocket, laid it on the table, and continued, "I got a partial scholarship, but I'll still need to cover about $20,000 a year. I'll handle the rest if you could help me with the first year. I'll get a job and maybe take out student loans. I promise." That's when my dad finally put his knife down, looked straight at me, and said, "Matthew, listen to me. You need to understand that our situation isn't what it used to be." Confused, I asked, "What do you mean?" Then he spoke. Slow, firm, and without hesitation. We already used up our savings on Andrew. He's about to start his pre-law program and the tuition's high. Payments are due soon. We can't afford to support both of you simultaneously. I turned to my mom, my voice starting to shake. So, you're saying you can't help me? She replied, calm but cold. You need to be realistic. College isn't for everyone. You could consider a trade school or start working. Not everyone is cut out for a long academic path. And in that moment, I looked over at my brother. Andrew was still sitting there, silent. He didn't defend me, didn't say a word. He just kept eating, like none of this had anything to do with him. The anger inside me boiled over, but I still tried to hold it in to understand. So, I'm not worth investing in? I asked, my voice cracking, right after I said that the mood in the room shifted. My dad lowered the newspaper, tossed it aside, leaned forward, and looked at me coldly like a stranger. His words were sharp, with no hesitation. Raising you this far was already more than enough. What? You think you're something special? I froze. My mom put her fruit knife down and raised her voice. Always playing the victim. What do you think this is, a bank? We fed you, raised you, paid for your schooling, and now you want more. That was the moment I couldn't hold back anymore. Rage surged through my chest and up my throat. I snapped. I'm not asking for anything huge. I want a chance. 1 year. I've worked hard. I've done well. I've never messed up. I want to be treated like part of this family. My dad shot up from his chair, his face flushed red. He slammed his hand on the table. You were a mistake the second you were born. You hear me? Your mom and I only ever planned for one child. You were the accident. I shot up, too, my face burning, chest heaving with fury. So what now? You're kicking me out so this family can return to the original plan? If I'm the accident, at least this accident doesn't live off of favoritism like Andrew. Then I turned to my brother. And you? Sitting there, hearing all of this, can't defend me, fine, but do you not have a shred of decency? You think this is fair? Andrew didn't even look up. He kept his head down, eating like none of this involved him. And somehow, that silence, that indifference, disgusted me more than being called a mistake. And maybe bringing up Andrew was the final straw. My dad immediately pointed to the door and shouted, "Get out of my house. Now." I shouted back, "Gladly. I'd rather sleep at a damn bus stop than stay here 1 more minute." He stormed around the table, grabbed my arm, and dragged me toward the front door. I wrestled free halfway, shoved him back, and yelled, "You think this is discipline? No, this is you giving up. This is you walking away from being a parent." But he didn't say another word. He opened the door and shoved me out with both hands. I almost slipped on the front step. And when the door slammed behind me, this time it wasn't just noise. It was final. I stood there in the dark. No shoes, no jacket. And at that moment I didn't feel sad. I felt angry. Angry at them. Angry at myself. Forever believing they might see me differently someday. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. This time it was my mom. She didn't look at me. I just tossed out 2 backpacks, one old with a broken zipper. Her voice was dry as dust. "Go wherever you want. There's no room for you here." Then the door shut again. For good. No more shouting. No more voices. I stood there with 2 backpacks and a fury I had never known. But in the middle of that rage, one thing became more apparent than ever. I never had a home to begin with. Right after the door slammed shut again, I just stood there, frozen. Couldn't move. Couldn't think. The cold wind started cutting through my thin shirt, but I couldn't feel it. My eyes stared blankly into the darkness ahead, my mind empty, like I had just been erased from this life. I don't know how long I stood like that, but eventually, I slowly bent down and picked up the 2 backpacks my mom had thrown out, and then I walked away without looking back. In that moment, I knew there was nothing left to return to. This wasn't some temporary fight or the usual "you're old enough to move out" moment. This was the end. As I walked, I pulled out my phone. My fingers were shaking from the cold and the anger, but I managed to dial the number of my best friend from high school, Jason. He picked up after a couple of rings, but my throat tightened before I could even get a word out. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. "Hey, you free right now? I just got kicked out of my house." There was a pause, 2 seconds of silence, and then Jason answered, his voice full of genuine concern. "Where are you? I'm coming to get you." I didn't know whether I wanted to laugh or cry at that moment. The only person who opened a door for me that night wasn't family. It was a friend. About 30 minutes later, Jason pulled up in his beat-up old Toyota with the chipped paint. He stepped out, didn't ask a bunch of questions, didn't make a scene. He just said one thing, "Get in. You're staying at my place tonight." I got in the passenger seat, clutching the two worn-out backpacks. My hands were still ice cold, but something in my chest started to warm up, because I didn't feel entirely alone for the first time that night. When we got to his place, I crashed on an old mattress in the living room, using a balled-up hoodie as a pillow. The ceiling above me was nothing special, but I stared at it all night, unable to sleep. And in that quiet darkness, I made a promise to myself. One day, I'm going to make it, not to prove anything to them, but so no one will ever get to call me a mistake again. I barely spoke to anyone during those first few days at Jason's place. I ate, I slept, and I stayed silent. But that only lasted a few days. I wouldn't let myself stay down for too long. Emotions might knock me over for a moment, but I refused to let them keep me there. By the end of the first week, I was already online, searching for work. I had 2 months before the school year started, and I knew I had to do something, anything, to survive this phase. I landed a job at a small coffee shop near downtown, morning shifts, 6 a.m. to noon. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me from feeling useless. I arrived 15 minutes early daily, wiped down counters, set up tables, took out the trash, and taught myself how to make espresso without anyone asking. I didn't have time to complain. I had no right to expect anything. All I could do was work and move forward. When August came, I officially moved into the campus dorms. Tiny room with bunk beds, and 2 guys packed into a tight, noisy space. But for the first time since that night I was kicked out, I had a place I could call mine. During my first week of school, I applied for student loans, a low-interest, government-backed loan I wouldn't have to repay until after graduation. I knew it would weigh on me for years, but I didn't care about the future at that moment. All I knew was that this was the only way forward. Those 4 years of college were anything but easy. I went to class during the day and worked restaurant shifts at night. During midterms, there were weeks I didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. On snowy winter days, I still biked to work, hands numb and burning from the cold. I've eaten instant noodles in the library at 3 a.m., studying through tears, tired, starving, and with no time to rest. And throughout those 4 years, my parents didn't call me once. No texts, no check-ins. They disappeared like I had never existed. The only person who stayed in touch was my aunt. She'd text me before big exams with little messages like, "Make sure you're sleeping enough," or "Hang in there, I'm rooting for you." Sometimes, she'd call to ask if I'd eaten or if working the night shift was wearing me down. Once in a while, she'd even stop by campus with a hot meal or a few cold meds, scolding me gently. "It's freezing, and you're out here acting like you're made of steel." When I asked her about my parents, she'd stay quiet for a long time, then sigh. Her voice was always soft, but if you listened closely, you could hear the sadness. I tried talking to them. I did, but they wouldn't listen. And there's only so much I can do. She never badmouthed them. She never made promises she couldn't keep. She was just there, constant, quiet, steady. And somehow that was enough to keep me from feeling completely alone. Sometimes, that's all it takes to keep going. The day I graduated, the sun was soft, the wind light, but just enough to make my graduation gown flutter with every step I took toward the stage. I stood there, diploma in hand, graduating with honors, and applause echoed from all directions. But I didn't scan the crowd for my parents like the other graduates. I knew they weren't there. They didn't even know what day it was. The only person I looked for was my aunt. And just like I expected, she was there, sitting in one of the back rows, holding a bouquet of fresh flowers. Her dress was slightly wrinkled, probably from rushing over straight from work. When our eyes met, she smiled. Not loud, not dramatic, just a gentle nod that said, "I knew you could do it." The ceremony flew by, but that moment, that quiet connection, I'll never forget. Right after graduation, I got an interview invite from a mid-sized financial firm in Chicago. I'd interned there during my junior summer, and apparently, I'd left an impression. After taxes and deductions, they offered me a starting salary of $72,000 a year. For a fresh grad, that was more than reasonable. I said yes without hesitation. With my first paycheck, after covering rent and bills and chipping away at my student loans, I set aside just enough for one thing: to take my aunt and Jason out for a proper dinner. We picked a small Italian place, not fancy but warm and welcoming. My aunt arrived early, hair pinned up, crossbody bags slung over her shoulder, and barely any makeup. Jason showed up in a wrinkled button-up, hair still as messy as it was in high school. I stood up, poured water for both of them, then said, "This one's on me, because if it weren't for you two, I wouldn't be sitting here today." My aunt smiled, eyes glistening just a bit. After I finished placing our order, she reached across the table, gently held my hand, and said, softly but firmly, "I'm so proud of you, but don't stop here, okay? Keep moving forward." At that moment, her words weren't just encouragement. They were a reminder of something much deeper. She believed in me when the rest of the world had turned its back. And that's what made me know I couldn't stop now. For years after graduation, I made the final payment on my student loans, and for the first time, I had a decent amount of savings to my name. I'd scraped for every dollar, skipped vacations, and turned down more hangouts than I could count. I'd been laser-focused, cutting every non-essential expense to stay ahead. And on that very same day, a wild thought crossed my mind. At first, it was just a passing question. What if I started my own company? I dismissed it immediately. It sounded ridiculous, especially coming from someone who had just gotten their life in order. But the idea didn't go away. It lingered. It was there in the mornings while I made coffee. At night, when I stared at company reports from the firm I worked for, I kept seeing mistakes that leadership overlooked, strategies they were too scared to try. And the same thought kept growing louder. If it were me, I'd do things differently. One weekend night, I brought it up to Jason. We sat in our usual corner at the bar we'd been going to since I landed my first job. I laid it all out, half excited, half unsure. He stared at me for a few seconds, then burst out laughing. "You're nuts. You just got out of one mess, and now you're ready to dive headfirst into another." I nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, I know, but I can't sit still anymore." Jason stopped laughing. He looked at me for a second, then gave me a solid slap on the back and said, "You're insane, but I know you'll pull it off. No big speech. There are no dramatic promises." But for me, that was all the validation I needed. The very next day, I started writing the business plan. And that was day one of Lynx Capital. No office, no major funding, just one guy and a dream. And to turn that crazy dream into reality, it took me a full year. I didn't just write a business plan. I enrolled in short courses on management, corporate law, and even how to pitch to investors and write proposals that would get read. By day, I worked my full-time job. By night, I buried myself in research, revising plans, sketching out business models, and calculating every last number. I lived like I had nothing to lose. Honestly, I didn't, except time. When things finally felt solid enough, I took the first real step. I applied for a small business loan. Just enough to register the company, rent a tiny office on the third floor of an old building, and pay salaries to precisely 3 people, including me. I named it Lynx Capital. It sounds sharp and cool, but I liked the image of a lynx, small, sharp, and unafraid to hunt something more significant than itself. My hands were shaking the day I signed the lease on that first office space. The day I printed my first business card with founder and CEO under my name. I stared at it for hours, and 4 years later, by the time I turned 30, I had a company of my own. No longer just a dream, no longer a Google Doc plan gathering digital dust. A real business with clients, a team, revenue, and the kind of pressure that wakes you before your alarm. But more important than all of that, it was mine. Built from the very place where people once told me, "You're not good enough to become anything." After all those years of grinding, saving every penny, and living under the weight of pressure and doubt, I realized something. I didn't need anyone's pat on the back anymore. But I also knew there are certain milestones in life. If you don't celebrate them yourself, no one else will do it for you. So, on my 30th birthday, I took a portion of the company's profit. Not a crazy amount, nothing reckless. Just enough to finally do 2 things I had dreamed of quietly. Back when I was crashing on a friend's floor with 2 beat-up backpacks. The first is a small house in a quiet suburb. Not a mansion, no sprawling yard, but it was mine. A place with sunlit windows, a cozy living room, and, most importantly, a place I could call home without bowing my head or asking anyone's permission. The second is a brand new car. Not a flashy sports car. Just a clean, well-built sedan. Strong, reliable, and ready to take me wherever I needed. I still remember the moment I held the keys and walked out of the showroom. Pride in my chest, a calm in my mind, as I had just stepped into a new chapter of my life. I didn't post a single photo online. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I just stood in that new house, poured myself a quiet glass of wine, leaned against the window frame, looked at the car parked out front, and whispered, "You did it." Then I set the glass down, walked back to my desk, because the biggest dream I have, it is still being written. Regarding my family, we completely cut off contact after that night. No one called, texted, or even asked if I was alive, and I didn't try to hold on to any ties with them. I used to think that was how I'd live forever. No get-togethers, no conversations, not even a single family dinner. I just carried on like that. And honestly, I managed to live well. Then, 6 months ago in mid-November, right before Thanksgiving, everything changed. I was working when my phone rang. It was my aunt. After a few routine check-ins, she paused and said, "This year, the family Thanksgiving will be at my place. And I hope you'll come." I was silent for a few seconds. All I could think was, no. I do not need to see the people who once kicked me out. I have no reason to sit at the same table with them, sharing turkey and cranberry sauce, when every word they said back then still echoes in my mind as if it were just yesterday. I was set on saying no, truly. But then, my aunt added in a gentle yet firm tone, "It's time for you to step into the light, so they can see how wrong they were." That stopped me in my tracks. I no longer needed their acceptance, but I realized I needed to look them in the eye, as the person I've become, not as the child who was once thrown out. And so I nodded, not out of a desire for reconciliation, not out of forgiveness, but because I was ready for them to face the truth. The mistake they once dismissed, have lived, and I've done even better than they ever imagined. On Thanksgiving Day, I drove to my aunt's house with a bottle of red wine in hand. Not the kind you bring to show off, but pleasant enough to say I'm not here casually. By the time I arrived, the house was nearly complete. The air was warm, laughter and chatter spilling from the kitchen into the living room. It smelled like roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. I glanced around, and there they were, my parents, standing near the dessert table. They saw me the second I stepped through the door, but they just glanced at me for a second, then looked away, like I was a server or a neighbor just passing through. Across the living room, I spotted Andrew. He was holding a little girl, probably his daughter. It's the same confident stance, same half-smirk. He is still playing the hero in the family that once put him on a pedestal. The moment he saw me, he raised his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, look who showed up. That wine looks fancy. But hey, you made it. That's what counts. No need to pretend you're something you're not." I laughed, just a short, quiet laugh. Shook my head, didn't respond. It's not worth the breath. A few relatives recognized me. Some looked shocked. Others are just confused. They started saying the same small talk I'd heard 100 times before. "Oh my God, is that Matthew? Didn't even recognize you. How've you been? Wow, it's been forever, huh?" I nodded, offered a polite smile. No big emotions. And then my aunt, Everly, walked out from the kitchen, still holding a pie tray. She set it down the moment she saw me and came straight over. She hugged me tight. Her voice was warm but steady. "Thank you for coming. I know this wasn't easy, but I'm so proud of you." I smiled. "I'm proud of you too, Aunt Everly." And just like that, I stayed. The party was unfolding in a warm, cheerful rhythm. Voices overlapped in laughter and chatter. Cutlery clinked softly. Light jazz drifted from a small speaker in the corner. I sat quietly at a table by the window with a glass of water. Now and then, I'd nod politely at someone walking past. Then, like he couldn't stand the idea of me being there without becoming the center of attention, my father spoke up. He raised his wine glass, stood up, and announced, voice filled with pride, "I'd like to share some good news on this special occasion. My son, Andrew, was promoted to Bennett and Rowe Capital Manager. You all know that firm, right? One of the top financial companies in the state." Scattered applause followed. My mother jumped in before anyone else could even respond. "And that's not all. Andrew's about to close a deal worth $2 million with a major client. We're so incredibly proud of him." The room erupted. Gasps, head nods, admiring glances. "That's amazing. 2 million? Wow. Andrew's carrying the family name." I stayed in my seat, silent. No nods, no reactions. Not because I was surprised, but because I already knew. I knew exactly what deal they were talking about. I knew the client. I was the one who sat down, personally, with the director of Bennett and Rowe Capital to negotiate the details of that partnership. We'd had several meetings, shared a few glasses of wine in my office, at Lynx Capital. Andrew? He wasn't in any of those meetings. His name wasn't on any document. He must have overheard something, and used it to grab the spotlight. I wasn't surprised. Not even a little. I just sipped my water slowly, and let a small smile cross my face. Not bitter. Not angry. Because I know something they don't. The truth. It has a way of speaking for itself. Just as the praise for my brother was starting to settle, one of my relatives, an aunt by marriage on my mom's side, I think, turned toward me from the dining table and asked out loud, casually, with no malice at all, "Oh, and what about Matthew? What are you up to these days?" The room fell silent, just for a beat. Before I could answer, my mother looked away, lips pressed tight, and my father cut in sharp, cold. "Him? He hasn't done anything worth mentioning and has always been a mess since he was a kid. But, well, he was a mistake. We only ever planned for one child." A ripple of whispers followed. Some relatives stared wide-eyed. Others turned away, awkward, unsure what to say. I stayed where I was, quiet. I'd heard that word, mistake, so many times it barely registered anymore. But that day I didn't need to say a thing, because before I could even open my mouth, Aunt Everly stepped in. She set her glass down firmly and stood up. Her eyes were fiery, but her voice was steady and clear. "That's enough. You don't feel ashamed saying that out loud?" She turned slightly, her tone rising, but still composed. "That mistake you two disowned? He's the one who climbed out of the mud and built a life on his own. He's the one who never asked you for a single cent after you threw him out with nothing but 2 torn-up backpacks." She paused for a moment, then scanned the room before continuing, this time with absolutely no attempt to hide the pride in her voice. "Matthew is not some failure like you're trying to paint him. He's the founder of Lynx Capital, a private financial firm. And let me be clear, he's pulling in 7 figures yearly." Right after my aunt finished speaking, and the room was still caught in that stunned silence, Andrew suddenly stood up. His voice was loud, dripping with sarcasm. "This is ridiculous. Are you seriously making stuff up for him now? Matthew, CEO of Lynx Capital? That's funny because my firm is about to sign a deal with Lynx Capital, and even I don't know who the CEO is." He looked straight at me, eyes full of challenge, like he was waiting for me to squirm. Right on cue, my mother jumped in, her tone laced with contempt. "This boy's always been a show-off, so dramatic, always chasing some fantasy." Then my father slammed his hand on the table, his voice low and sharp. "What's he good at, huh? Starts some no-name company, gives himself a fancy title, thinks that makes him special?" I took a deep breath, that sting in my throat. I held it down. Looking at them, I didn't feel hurt anymore, just tired and done. Then I said it, calm, slow, and clear, each word dropping heavy into the silence. "You have exactly 5 minutes to apologize to me. If not, don't blame me for doing something I don't want to." The room jolted like it had just snapped out of holding its breath. But instead of owning up to anything, they laughed. That kind of laugh cuts deep, mocking, dismissive, loud. My mother clapped once, voice shrill with sarcasm. "Oh wow, listen to you. Who do you think you are, giving us ultimatums?" My father leaned in across the table, face red with rage. "Go ahead, let's see what kind of performance you've got." 5 minutes later, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. No hesitation, no emotion, just a cold, focused calm. I scrolled through my contacts, tapped on a familiar name, and called. It rang twice. Then the voice on the other end picked up. I spoke immediately, without missing a beat. "Jack, it's me. Someone here claimed they were closing the $2 million deal with your company. Do you know Andrew Peterson?" There was a pause. Then Jack's voice came back, clearly confused. "Who? Say that again." I didn't flinch. "Andrew Peterson. He's standing right in front of me." Andrew was still grinning, arms crossed, whispering something smug to the person beside him. "He's bluffing. Just putting on a show," he muttered. But less than 2 minutes later, his phone started ringing. Loud. In the dead silence of the room, it might as well have been a siren. Every head turned. His eyes widened. He flinched, but answered the call. quickly stepping into the corner, one hand cupped over the phone. And then, loud enough for people nearby to hear, came Jack's voice, sharp, angry, and undeniable. "Who gave you the right to speak on my behalf? Who the hell do you think you are?" Andrew froze, color drained from his face, sweat beaded on his temple. He nodded meekly, stammering out a string of weak, barely audible, "Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." The room was dead silent. The mockery, the laughter, the smug glances. They were gone, evaporated like they were never there. My parents stood frozen, pale and shaken. Not a word from either of them. Not even eye contact. I turned to my aunt, my voice soft, steady. "If it's all right, I think I'll head out." I believe this was enough. She reached out and gently took my hand, her eyes warm with a flicker of sadness. "I understand. Thank you for showing up." 2 days after the Thanksgiving dinner, I was in a strategy meeting when the internal line rang. It was the front desk. The receptionist's voice was a bit hesitant. "Mr. Matthew, 5 people are waiting at reception. 4 adults and 1 little girl. They say, they're your family. They're asking to see you urgently." I didn't answer right away. I leaned toward the security monitor and tapped through the camera angles until it showed the lobby. Just as I expected. My parents, Andrew, his wife, and the little girl, his daughter. They stood there, looking uneasy and tense. My mother clutched her handbag tightly to her chest. My father paced with his arms crossed. Andrew sat on a leather chair, hunched over, head down. None of the arrogance from the party left on his face. I knew exactly why they were here. Right after that phone call at Thanksgiving, Bennett and Roe Capital made their decision. Andrew was fired. On the spot. That fall must have shaken them to the core. I spoke back to the receptionist, slow and deliberate. "Tell them to wait in the lobby. Do not invite them upstairs. And don't say anything more." Then I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Miller, our company's legal counsel. The call lasted 1 minute. "I need you down in the lobby," I said. "My family's here. No appointment. Just enough to become a problem. I want you to handle it for me." His voice didn't waver. No surprise, just clarity. "I've got it. I'll be there in 10. I hung up and went right back to my meeting, like nothing had happened. Because this time, I wasn't the kid being thrown out in the middle of the night with 2 ripped backpacks. This time, I was the one who decided who gets to come in and who stays out. 10 minutes later, right on schedule, Mr. Miller, my company's legal representative, stepped into the lobby. He wore a sharp gray suit, a slim briefcase in hand, moving with a calm, composed authority that spoke louder than any raised voice ever could. He didn't sit down. I didn't ask how anyone was doing. He pulled out a thin set of documents, placed them on the glass coffee table in front of them, and spoke, slowly and with the weight of stone in every word. "I'm here on behalf of the CEO of Lynx Capital. First, I'm formally requesting that you refrain from contacting him in any way, directly or indirectly. If you ignore this, the company will take legal action. There will be no second warning." The air in the lobby immediately snapped tight, tense as a pulled wire. My mother's eyes widened, about to speak, but Mr. Miller wasn't finished. "Furthermore, if at any point moving forward, any of you attempt to damage Mr. Matthew Peterson's reputation or that of Lynx Capital, this company will not hesitate to respond. We are fully prepared with documentation, audio records, witnesses, and legal counsel to take this matter to court if necessary." Andrew shot up from his chair at that moment, sending it clattering backwards. His face flushed red, eyes wild with fury. He shouted, "You bastard! Do you think you're better than us? You're not successful. You're just lucky." His voice echoed through the entire lobby. The receptionist flinched. Other guests began turning their heads. Within seconds, 2 security guards stepped in from the side entrance. One of them walked directly up to Andrew and said, firm and cold, "This group needs to leave the premises immediately. This is your first and final warning." My parents scrambled to their feet. My mother tugged the little girl's hand. Andrew resisted, muttering, glaring, but eventually followed them out the door. As the glass doors slid shut behind them, I stood on the upper floor, looking down behind the tall office windows. Not angry, not bitter, just light in the way you feel when you finally walk away from something that never deserved to define you in the first place. From a family that only ever knew how to exclude. It's been 6 months since the day I saw my family again after more than a decade apart. 6 months since that Thanksgiving dinner, the night every mask came off, the night truth was finally called by its name, and that night, I understood one thing more clearly than ever. Some people, blood or not, do not deserve your trust. I'm sharing this story not to brag, not to say I'm successful, wealthy, or that I got my revenge. I'm sharing it because maybe somewhere out there, there's someone like I was at 18, rejected, dismissed, called a mistake. And if that's you, if you've read this far, I want you to know something. Someone else's eyes do not measure your worth. Your family may have brought you into this world, but that doesn't mean they get to decide who you are. If they don't value you, don't waste your life trying to prove you're worthy of their love. Use that life to live well, for yourself. I used to think that forgiveness was the only way to move forward. But now I know sometimes letting go is even stronger than forgiveness. I don't hate them, but I'm not opening the door again to people who once threw me into the night and called it parenting. And if I had one piece of advice for anyone who's ever been dismissed, denied, or made to feel like they don't belong, don't try to become what they want. Become the best version of yourself. And one day, when you're standing strong on your own 2 feet, you'll look back and smile. Thank you for leaving me behind. Because of that, I learned how far I could go alone. And before I end this story, I want to ask you one thing. Was I wrong? I walked away from my family, the people who once abandoned me. I chose not to forgive or offer them another chance after everything they put me through. I won't lie. There were moments I asked myself, was I too harsh? But every time I remember the look in my mother's eyes when she said, "You were a mistake." I know, some things aren't meant to be forgotten. And maybe they shouldn't be. But what about you? What do you think? Was I right or wrong? What would you have done if you were in my place? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I truly want to hear them. Not just because this is my story, but because maybe it's yours too. And if you found this story worth sharing, hit like, subscribe, and pass it along to someone who might need the push to stand up for themselves. Thank you for staying with me till the very end. See you in the following story. And wherever you are on your journey, never stop believing in your worth. Go home. There's no room left. That was the cruel sentence my mother said to us, right in front of my 6-year-old son, when we came to attend the Christmas party 2 years ago at my grandmother's house. We left right after that, but my grandmother didn't let things pass so easily. She asked me to come back to the party, and what she did after that made my parents regret it. Follow my story. I'll tell you what happened next. Hello everyone. My name is Marcus. I'm 35 years old and currently the branch manager of a company specializing in car rentals and used car sales in Denver, Colorado. This isn't the job I dreamed of as a kid, but it gives me a stable income and the flexibility to care for my family. I live with my wife, Paisley, and our 8-year-old son, Logan, in a house in Thornton, a quiet suburb just 10 minutes from the office. Every morning, I wake up to Logan laughing in the room next door. He's always excited to tell me about his strange dreams. Paisley is usually busy in the kitchen making breakfast, sometimes reminding me not to forget my phone before I head out. These simple moments make me realize that true happiness doesn't have to be complicated. Still, there are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, haunted by the memories of the Christmas party in 2023. Some nights, I sit straight up in bed, my shirt soaked, and I know deep down, I still haven't been able to let go of the images of my parents and my younger brother. My story begins on a weekend evening in December, just a few days before Christmas. Our family had just finished a cozy dinner that night, grilled meat and mashed potatoes, Logan's favorite. While Paisley was clearing the table and Logan was playing with his Legos in the living room, my phone suddenly rang. When I saw the name Grandma Helen light up on the screen, my heart instantly felt warmer. I picked up right away, because in my family, she's the only one who's ever truly loved me. My grandmother, Helen, is 78 years old, but still healthy and sharp. She was the only one in the family who ever stood up for me, especially when my parents constantly favored Charles, my younger brother. After asking a few kind questions about Logan, she got to the main reason for her call. She told me this year's Christmas would be held at her big house in Boulder, and she hoped my family would be there. The moment she said it, a quiet dread crept into my chest. After over a year of avoiding them, the thought of seeing my parents and Charles again made my throat tighten. Still, I didn't want to disappoint her, so I said yes. I told her, yes, I'll bring Paisley and Logan. But after I hung up, my mind spun with 100 different thoughts. I didn't want to upset her, but the idea of showing up at that party filled me with anxiety. After the call with Grandma, while I was still lost in thoughts, Paisley walked in from the kitchen. She saw the worried look on my face and immediately asked, "What's wrong? You don't look okay." I pulled her into a chair and told her about Grandma's invitation. After listening, Paisley looked at me with concern in her eyes and asked, "Do you want to go? I know you don't feel comfortable seeing them again." Right after she asked, I let out a deep sigh and said, "I don't want to disappoint Grandma. She's the only family member who's ever truly loved me." Paisley gently placed her hand on mine and gave it a light squeeze. She said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Hearing those words from her, I felt grateful, lucky even. I want a wife who understands me and always stands by me. After nearly 2 minutes of thinking in silence, I told her, "We'll go to Grandma's party. We can't keep running from this." And more importantly, she invited us. Just as I finished speaking, Logan, sitting nearby, suddenly shouted with excitement. While building his Legos, he had been secretly listening to everything. His excitement reminded me of all the times he'd visited my grandmother with us. Even though he'd only seen her a few times, Logan adored Grandma Helen. He suggested we make a greeting card for her, and even asked Paisley if she could bake something for her, because about 3 months ago, when we visited, Grandma had loved one of Paisley's cakes. Back then, Paisley had suggested that Logan make cards for both his grandparents. But Logan refused. He said, "Grandma and Grandpa don't like me. They only care about Adrian, so I'm not making them cards." Hearing those words from my son hit me hard. I wasn't sad because he didn't love my parents. I was sad because my son never got to feel their love, all because of the shadow cast by Adrian and Charles. Adrian is the son of Charles, my younger brother. Since we were kids, Charles had always been the golden child of my parents, and when Adrian was born, he inherited the title of golden grandchild in the family. My childhood growing up with Charles was filled with unfairness. All because Charles had a smoother mouth than I did and was smarter. He always knew how to win over the adults. When I broke a glass, Mom would scold me, and I would stay silent. But when Charles broke a glass, he would immediately find Mom and say, "Dear Mom, your sweet son accidentally broke the glass." Then she would hug him and say, "It's okay." Or at dinner, whenever our parents had something new, he would instantly throw in a few compliments like, "Mom, your new hair looks beautiful." Or, "Dad, you're a hero in my heart." I couldn't say those things. He didn't just know how to charm our parents. He also knew how to impress guests who came over with fancy compliments. That's why my parents, at some point, started to favor him. I thought their favoritism would stop when we got older, married, and had children. But it didn't. My parents clearly showed the difference between Logan and Adrian. They favored Adrian way too much. When Logan was born, my parents only visited briefly. But when Adrian was born, they gave him $5,000 to help with diapers and formula. Also, my mom stayed at the hospital for several days to help Charles's wife care for Adrian. As the kids grew up, she always took pictures of Adrian and posted them on her personal Facebook, but she never mentioned Logan. During family meals when we got together, the conversation always revolved around Adrian. Then, more than a year ago, we had a big argument on my father's birthday. After the party ended that day, my parents gave Adrian a gift, a plane ticket to Hawaii to go with them. I asked Mom about Logan's share. She replied coldly, "Logan can go next time. If we ever take another trip, we'll bring him." After that, I stood up and pointed out how unfair they were. When I finished speaking, Mom didn't argue back. Instead, she said, "If you feel it's unfair, then don't ever return to this house." Since then, I've stopped bringing my wife and Logan over. Back to the story of the Christmas party at my grandmother's house. For a whole week before Christmas, Logan worked on a beautiful card to give to great-grandmother. The card was made from green paper that he had cut into the shape of a Christmas tree. On the front, he drew a little house with smoke curling out of the chimney, and next to it was an elderly lady with silver hair smiling. Logan wrote in wobbly red crayon letters at the tree's base, "I love you, great-grandma. Merry Christmas." In the top right corner, he glued a small yellow star. Every night after dinner, Logan would sit at the table and color the card. Now and then he'd ask me, "Dad, does this look good?" and when I nodded and told him yes, his face would light up like he'd just been rewarded. On Christmas morning, Logan went into the kitchen to help Paisley bake. The two of them worked and joked together. Sometimes Paisley would playfully dab some frosting on his nose, and the two would giggle. Seeing Logan grinning with his frosting-covered nose made me smile. When he noticed me smiling, he ran over and hugged my leg, leaving a spot of frosting on my jeans. Paisley looked at me apologetically, but I shook my head and gently brushed Logan's hair. Seeing the smiles on my son's and wife's faces in that warm kitchen, with the sweet smell of baked goods in the air, I hoped that that year's Christmas party would be meaningful, and I truly believed I was right to accept Grandma's invitation. At that moment, I had no idea that just a few hours later, my mother, Nancy, would give us a shock we would never forget for the rest of our lives. Around 4 p.m., our family left Denver and headed to Grandma's house in Boulder. We had planned to arrive early, before 5, but because of traffic caused by an accident, it was almost 6:30 when we arrived. On the way, Logan sat in the back seat, constantly asking, "When will we get to great-grandmother's house?" He held the card tightly, worried it might get wrinkled. Paisley sat beside me, occasionally glancing over with an anxious look, afraid we were getting there too late. When our car turned onto the familiar street leading to Grandma's house, my stomach tightened. The two-story white house with the red tile roof came into view, surrounded by large oak trees covered in twinkling Christmas lights. In front of the house, the driveway and curb were packed with cars. I recognized Charles's blue Honda Civic and my parents' silver Camry among them. There were a few other cars I didn't realize, probably from distant relatives. At that moment, my heart started beating strangely and uneasily. It had been over a year since I last came home or attended any gathering at my parents' place, ever since the day they favored Adrian right in front of Logan. After finding a spot to park at the end of the street, we walked up to Grandma's front door and rang the bell. Paisley stood beside me holding Logan, who was still clutching the card and the box of cookies in his hands. I could hear laughter and chatter coming from inside, soft Christmas music playing, and the smell of delicious food drifting out. The door opened slightly in less than a minute, and my mother, Nancy, stood. She was wearing a red sweater with a reindeer pattern, and her hair was done up neatly, looking nothing like the simple woman I used to know. It was hard to describe how I felt at that moment. Part of me was happy to see my mom after more than a year apart, but another part was nervous about how she would react. When she saw us, her eyes moved from me to Paisley, then to Logan, who was beaming. Her expression was cold as ice, nothing like the warmth I had hoped for. Then, in the same cold tone, she said, "Go home. There's no room left." I froze after those words. My heart seemed to stop for a moment, and my head spun trying to process what had just happened. Beside me, Paisley stood frozen too, her eyes wide in disbelief. She instinctively tightened her grip on my hand. Logan was just over 6, but even he understood what my mom had said. The smile on his face slowly disappeared. His bright eyes turned confused. He looked up at me, then at Paisley, not understanding why we were being turned away. After a short silence, I tried to stay calm and said to my mother, "Grandma invited us. There's no way there's no room." Without hesitation, my mom shot back dryly, "Helen told me if you showed up late, send you away." I stood there in shock, like someone had squeezed the air right out of my chest. She shut the door before I could say anything else, leaving my family alone. The cheerful sounds of the party inside went on, like we had never even existed. As I reached for the doorbell again, determined to find out the truth, Paisley gently stopped me. I looked at her. She shook her head, her eyes filled with sympathy, and softly said, "Let's go. I don't want Logan to see any more of this." I looked down at my son. Logan stood there, wide-eyed and confused, still holding the card and the box of cookies. In trembling, he asked, "Dad, why didn't Grandma let us in?" "I made this card for great-grandmother." Hearing that innocent question shattered me. I had no idea how to explain the cruelty of adults to a 6-year-old. Without wasting another second, I picked Logan up, took Paisley's hand, and walked away from Grandma's house. When we got to the car and I opened the door for Logan, he burst into tears. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he sobbed, "Dad, I just wanted to give great-grandmother the card." My heart broke into pieces watching him cry. I held him close, feeling completely powerless. Paisley sat beside me, her eyes red, fighting back her tears. That was the moment I made a promise to myself. For the rest of my life, I would never let my son see my mother, Nancy, again. After leaving Grandma's house, I drove to a nearby Denny's for dinner. On the way there, Logan kept quietly sobbing and would occasionally ask, "Dad, is great-grandmother mad at me?" Every question from him felt like a knife to my heart. Paisley had to calm him down by discussing the tasty food he could eat at Denny's. She said, "Do you want pancakes with maple syrup? Or maybe some crispy fried chicken? They even have cotton candy." Logan immediately perked up. His eyes lit up when he heard about the cotton candy. He clapped his hands and said, "I want pancakes and cotton candy." I smiled at how easily he bounced back. That's the thing about kids. One second they're crying their eyes out, and the next, they're laughing again like nothing ever happened. Looking at Logan in the rearview mirror, I saw he had stopped crying. Now he was just full of questions about food. Paisley glanced over at me, her eyes still worried, but there was relief there too. Seeing our son happy again brought her some comfort. When we pulled into the parking lot at Denny's, I looked at the card and the box of cookies still lying on the back seat. I felt a lingering regret and doubt about what had just happened. Knowing how strict my grandmother can be, it wouldn't be out of character for her to refuse someone entry just for being late. But the fact that it was my mother who delivered the message, that's what made me doubt everything. My phone suddenly rang as we were about to walk into Denny's. When I looked at the screen and saw the name Grandma Helen, I hesitated momentarily, then let it go to silence. I didn't want to talk to anyone right then, especially after what happened. When the phone rang again, Paisley looked at me and said gently, "You should pick up. Maybe something's wrong." Listening to her, I answered the call. Grandma's voice came through the speaker, filled with concern. "Marcus, is everything okay? Why haven't you all arrived yet?" Her question caught me entirely off guard. I quickly asked, "Didn't you tell my mom to send us away because we were late?" There was a brief pause. Then Grandma replied, clearly surprised, "I never said that." My mind exploded. So my mom had lied. Grandma had never told her to send us away. A wave of anger mixed with hurt washed over me. I couldn't believe my mother could be that cruel. Not only turning us away, but also blaming Grandma to cover it up. After a moment of silence, Grandma spoke again, her tone stern. "Come back. I'll get to the bottom of this." I let out a slow breath and answered, "I don't think making a big deal out of this is necessary. I'll stop by to see you another time." Suddenly, Grandma shouted, something I had never heard from her before. "Come back right now." I was stunned. I had never heard her so upset, so commanding. Grandma Helen, the gentle woman who had always spoken to me in a soft, loving tone, was now speaking with such firmness and anger. Her voice left me speechless. 30 seconds of silence passed. Then her voice came through again, calmer but still resolute. "I'm sorry for raising my voice. Please bring your family back. I'll be waiting." Her sincere apology broke something inside me. Grandma had always been the one person in the family who understood and truly loved me. If she was asking, I couldn't say no. In a quiet voice, I said, "We'll come back right away." Paisley, who had heard the whole conversation, looked at me with understanding. She nodded and said, "Let's go back." Standing in front of the restaurant, Logan didn't know what was happening. When he saw us heading back to the car, he asked, "Mom, Dad, aren't we eating here anymore?" I gently brushed his hair and said, "We're going to see Grandma Helen now." The moment I said that, Logan jumped with excitement. "Dad? Then let's go, hurry." Right after that, we got in the car and drove as fast as we could, heading back to Grandma's house. 10 minutes later, we were again standing in front of Grandma's house. This time, she was already outside waiting for us. Standing beside her were some distant aunts, uncles, my parents, and Charles and his family. The scene before me was surprising. Everyone was standing out on the porch in the cold Christmas night air. Their breath turned into little clouds in the freezing temperature. Grandma stood in the center with a stern expression, while my parents stood off to the side, clearly annoyed. As soon as we got out of the car, Charles, my younger brother, snapped with irritation. "Because of your family, Grandma and all of us had to wait out here in the cold." Before I could even respond, Grandma Helen shouted in a voice I had never heard from her before, "Shut up!" Her voice echoed through the still night air. Charles froze, stunned into silence. He didn't say another word. The other relatives stayed quiet too. No one dared to speak. Then Grandma walked over to us. Her expression softened. She hugged Paisley and me, then leaned down and gently took Logan's hand. In a soft voice, she said to him, Great-grandmother has been waiting a long time for you. Seeing her kindness, Logan smiled, still holding the card tightly. As we stepped inside the house, I walked past my mother. I glanced over and saw her face pale, her eyes avoiding mine. Paisley, walking beside me, sensed the tension too. She squeezed my hand firmly, as if to give me strength. Once we stepped into the living room, I saw it had been beautifully decorated for Christmas. A tall tree stood in the corner, covered in shimmering ornaments and twinkling lights. The table was filled with delicious food waiting to be served, and the fireplace crackled warmly, giving the room a cozy glow. Everything was perfect for a Christmas gathering, except for the suffocating tension in the air. Grandma stood in the center of the room, her face more serious than I had ever seen. In a clear and resolute voice, she said, "Before we continue with this celebration, some things need to be addressed." The room fell into complete silence. No one dared to cough or even shift. Relatives stood along the walls. Charles and his wife stood by Adrian, and my parents hovered near the back, looking like they were trying to disappear. Suddenly, Grandma turned to my mother and roared with unmistakable authority, "Nancy, is there anything you'd like to say to me? Or to Marcus and his family?" All eyes in the room turned to my mother. She said nothing, just stood there, pale as a sheet, hands trembling, unable to meet anyone's gaze. When she didn't speak, Grandma continued, her tone firmer now. "This is my house, not yours. Who gave you the right to send Marcus and his family away?" That question hit like a slap. My mother stammered, trying to defend herself. I didn't. Marcus is lying. I didn't send anyone away." Hearing her still deny it, trying to pin the blame on me, Grandma cut in with a voice that could freeze water. "Enough." Then she turned to Uncle Bruce, a longtime neighbor who often helped her fix things around the house. She called out, "Bruce, pull up the footage from the front door." Uncle Bruce took the tablet from Grandma's hands without hesitation. He was good with tech and often helped her set up and use electronic devices. He opened the security camera app with quick, practiced fingers and found the footage from when we arrived. The room was so quiet, you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Logan stood beside me, still clutching his card, confused by everything. Paisley held my hand tightly, both of us tense as we waited. A few seconds later, the familiar voice played from the tablet speaker, loud and clear, "Go home. There's no room left." My parents froze, their faces turned pale. Their eyes stared at the tablet like it was some monster. Then the second sentence came, even colder and more cutting. "Helen told me if you showed up late, I had to send you away." The voice was unmistakably my mother's. Flat, emotionless, and cruel. I looked around. The expressions on my parents' faces and Charles's family were like those of people who had just been caught in the act. Charles kept his head down, unable to look anyone in the eye. His wife held Adrian tightly, shielding him from what was unfolding. My father, Dennis, stood frozen, face drained of all color, and my mother was trembling so hard it looked like she might collapse. Whispers began to spread across the room. Relatives started murmuring to each other, their eyes casting judgmental glances toward my parents. No one could believe that Nancy, the woman they had always thought was kind, could be so cruel to her grandson. When the entire room had heard everything, Uncle Bruce shut off the video and set the tablet down. His face, too, showed quiet anger over what had just been revealed. The air around me felt thick with tension, almost hard to breathe. But inside, I felt something I hadn't felt all evening, relief. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, because finally the truth had come out. A short while later, the room began to stir with noise. The guests started speaking up, openly criticizing my mother. Janet, my dad's cousin, shook her head and said, "Nancy, I never thought you could do something like this." From the corner of the room, Uncle Mike, another cousin of my dad's, added, "This is too much. Christmas is about family being together. No one with a heart would kick their son and grandson out of a celebration. Even animals have more compassion than you, Nancy." The voices of disapproval spread quickly. Whispers turned into loud remarks. My mother stood there, completely isolated. Not a single person spoke in her defense. 2 minutes later, Grandma raised her hand, and instantly, the room fell silent. Her authority in the family was absolute. When she made a gesture, no one dared to disobey. Then, in a voice as cold as ice, she declared, "From this moment forward, I no longer have a son named Dennis. and I have no daughter-in-law named Nancy. The words struck the room like a bolt of lightning. My father, Dennis, cried out in a desperate voice, "Mom, you can't do this." My mother broke down in tears, sobbing as she pleaded, "I know I was wrong. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it." But Grandma had made up her mind. Her face was hard as stone, unmoved and resolute. She had endured the injustice in our family for far too long. Before they could speak again, she spoke loud and clear, her tone full of finality. "You have 30 days to leave the house you're living in. The estate in Highlands Ranch will be passed on to Marcus and his family. Tomorrow morning, I'll begin transferring ownership, and a formal eviction notice will be issued." They stood there in shock. The house my parents were living in was legally Grandma's, and the Highlands Ranch estate, one of her most valuable properties, was now being handed over to us. My father stammered, voice trembling, "You can't do this. I'm your son." Grandma looked him dead in the eye and said, her voice heavy with disappointment, "You stopped being my son when you favored Charles over Marcus. Now leave." Her words landed with finality. Dennis and Nancy stood frozen, like statues, unable to accept what had just happened. Moments later, they turned and quietly walked out, heads down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. After my parents left, Charles, my younger brother, stayed behind. He looked at Grandma, his voice tense with worry, and asked, "What about me? I'm your grandson, too." His question caught everyone off guard. Grandma turned to him, her eyes cold and expression unreadable. She answered plainly, "You won't have a share. You saw your parents mistreat Marcus and said nothing. You even took pride in it. Don't think I didn't notice." Charles tried to defend himself. "But Grandma, I didn't get involved in what Mom and Dad did. I just—" Grandma raised her hand, cutting him off before he could finish. Then she said, "You stayed silent in the face of injustice and benefited from it. That makes you complicit." Hearing this, Charles's face turned red with frustration. He grabbed his wife's hand and reached for Adrian, speaking through clenched teeth, "Fine. If that's how it is, we're leaving." Before walking out, Charles turned and looked straight at me, his eyes filled with bitterness. He shouted, "Are you happy now, Marcus? You've torn this whole family apart." I stood silently. I didn't respond. Deep down, I didn't feel proud or victorious. I only felt a deep, quiet sadness for everything lost. Charles stormed out, pulling his wife and son with him. Adrian, once the favored grandson, now looked like a confused child, completely lost in a situation he didn't understand. As the door closed again, the room fell silent. The remaining relatives looked at me with eyes full of sympathy, as if they had just witnessed the end of an era. At that moment, I saw what lay ahead, the fallout and the consequences of Grandma's decision. After they left, Grandma asked for the party to continue. She clapped her hands softly and said to everyone, "Let's enjoy this Christmas night. This is a time for real families to be together." The atmosphere in the room gradually returned to normal. The remaining relatives did their best to put aside what had just happened and focus on the celebration. Laughter and chatter slowly returned, though still a little stiff at first. As for Logan, he had been waiting for this moment all week. He ran over to great-grandmother with the card in his hands. Shyly, he held it up and said, "Great-grandmother, this is the Christmas gift I made for you." Grandma immediately took the card, her eyes lighting up as she looked at the childlike drawings. She hugged Logan tightly and said in a warm voice, "Thank you, sweetheart. I will frame this card and hang it on the living room wall for everyone to see." Logan grinned from ear to ear, overjoyed that his gift was appreciated. Later, my wife brought out the cookies she had made that morning for everyone to enjoy. The chocolate chip cookies were carefully decorated with colorful candy pieces. Our relatives and neighbors couldn't stop complimenting them. Janet said, "Paisley, these cookies are amazing. Can you share the recipe?" Uncle Bruce nodded. "Yes, they remind me of my childhood." Grandma helped slice and serve the cookies, her face brighter than it had been in a long time. It was as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Watching everyone enjoy themselves, I quietly gave thanks for what Grandma had done for our family. That night, since it was getting late and snow had begun to fall, we stayed overnight at Grandma's house. Logan slept with great-grandmother, while Paisley and I stayed in the living room. I slept more soundly than I had in years, as if I had finally been freed from a nightmare that had lasted far too long. I thought Grandma had spoken out of anger when she disowned my father and cut him off from his inheritance. But she wasn't joking. At 8 a.m. the next morning, after we had breakfast, toast and sunny-side-up eggs that she made herself, Grandma called her lawyer, Christian, to come to the house. He had been her attorney for years, a well-dressed man in his 60s with silver hair and a calm, professional presence. When Mr. Christian arrived, Grandma sat at the dining table to review the legal procedures. Paisley and I sat nearby while Logan played with the toys Grandma had laid out for him. Grandma authorized the lawyer to begin the process of transferring ownership of two properties. The two-story house in Lakewood where my parents had been living, a house she had bought for them 10 years ago, and the estate in Highlands Ranch, which she now intended to pass on to me and my wife. Together, those two properties were worth close to $2 million. As she gave her instructions, Mr. Christian carefully noted every detail for the legal paperwork. She also asked him to send an official notice demanding that my parents vacate the Lakewood house within 30 days. Mr. Christian nodded and replied, "I'll prepare everything and send the formal documents later today." In that moment, I felt deeply grateful to Grandma, not because of the money or the property, but because of the fairness and justice she had brought to our family. After the lawyer left, I stood up, hugged her tightly, and said with emotion in my voice, "Thank you, Grandma. I don't know what else to say." She gently patted my back and smiled. "I'm just doing what's right." Before we headed back to our home, she hugged Logan tightly and said to us, "Next time you visit, make sure to bake more cookies for me to give to the neighbors." They loved Paisley's cookies. Her simple request made both Paisley and me laugh. I told her, "If you want, we can bake cookies daily and bring them to you." As our car pulled away from her house, I looked back in the rearview mirror and saw her waving goodbye on the porch. And at that moment, I knew for sure our lives had entered a new chapter. I thought my parents would quietly walk away after what happened at Grandma's house, but they didn't. Instead of facing the consequences of their actions, they fought back recklessly. When they received the eviction notice from Christian, Grandma's attorney, they arrived at her house demanding answers. Maybe they thought they could convince her to reverse her decision, or at least make her feel guilty. After they left, Grandma called me. Her voice sounded tired. She said, "Marcus, I need to let you know. Your parents came by and caused a scene. You should be careful. They might show up at your house too." Through her account, I learned more about what happened. My father had shouted, demanding that she take everything back. My mother cried, saying Grandma was tearing the family apart. But Grandma stood firm. Ultimately, she threatened to call the police before they finally left. And just as she warned, that very afternoon, as I got home from work, my parents and Charles's family were standing in front of my house in Thornton. I had just pulled into the garage when I saw their faces full of anger at my front door. As I stepped outside, Charles came forward, his face red with rage. He pointed at me and said bitterly, "You'll choke on that mansion, Marcus." My mother stood beside him, her eyes red from crying, but her voice was filled with hatred. "I regret ever giving birth to you." That sentence, coming from my mother, left me stunned. I stood frozen for a moment, but I held my ground. I refused to let emotions take control. Seconds later, my father stepped up, his voice low and threatening. "If you still want us to consider you family, you'd better give up some of what Grandma gave you." They shouted and cursed at me for nearly 2 minutes. Neighbors began peeking through their windows, curious about the commotion. Instead of arguing or trying to reason with them, I calmly pulled out my phone and dialed 911. When the line connected, I said clearly, "Hi, there are individuals outside my home threatening me." Hearing that, my father yelled, "You're calling the cops on your father?" I looked him straight in the eyes and answered coldly, "Are you confused? I don't know who you are." That sentence hit him like a slap. He stood there speechless, face flushed with rage. Even Charles looked shocked. He hadn't expected me to stand up like that. A moment later, Charles's wife tugged on his arm and said, "Let's go. The police will be here any minute." Not wanting to get arrested for harassment, they reluctantly left. My parents got into their car, faces filled with hatred. Charles gave me one last look, full of resentment, before they drove away. 15 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. I invited them inside and explained everything from beginning to end. I also showed them the footage from our security camera, which clearly showed the threats. Officer Johnson, an experienced, middle-aged man, took detailed notes. He asked, "Would you like to file an official report?" Without hesitation, I nodded and told him, "Yes." I want this documented so I can apply for a restraining order. I'm worried they'll keep harassing my family. Just 1 week later, my parents and Charles's family received a formal notice from the court. They were legally prohibited from approaching my family for the next 3 years. No visits, phone calls, emails, no contact in any form. When I received my copy of the court order, I felt a wave of relief. Finally, my little family was protected from the very people who had caused us so much pain. Precisely 30 days after receiving the notice from Christian, my parents moved out of the house. That afternoon, I drove over to check on the place and found it empty. They had left behind some old furniture and stains on the walls, but at least they had complied with the court order. We didn't move in. The house in Lakewood, while beautiful, held too many painful memories of the old family. Instead, I hired contractors to renovate it completely, fresh paint, new carpet, repairs throughout. Once the work was done, I rented it out to a family of 6 for $2,000 a month. As for the estate in Highlands Ranch that Grandma had given us, we didn't move in there either. Paisley and I agreed we would stay in the home we bought together in Thornton, the one we built from the ground up, filled with memories and meaning. That was our real home. The estate had deteriorated over the years due to a lack of proper upkeep. I invested around $150,000 into fully restoring it, upgrading the plumbing and electrical systems, installing hardwood floors, modernizing the kitchen, and landscaping the garden. After renovating, I returned it to Premium Property Management to maintain and lease. Depending on the rental agreement, I now earn between $6,000 and $10,000 a month from it. But I didn't spend that money recklessly or use it for unnecessary luxuries. During the first month, we visited Grandma, and I tried to hand her all the rental income. She shook her head and gently refused. She said, "Keep it. That's the return on something I chose to give you. Use it to invest in Logan's future." Her words touched me deeply. I nodded and agreed. I opened a separate savings account for Logan and deposited most of the rental income. After everything we'd been through, I felt incredibly fortunate to have Grandma in my life. Not just because she gave us these properties, but because she taught me the actual value of fairness and genuine love. More than a year has passed since that fateful Christmas night. Life has changed in ways I never could have imagined. My parents are now living in another city, Phoenix, Arizona, surviving on their retirement benefits. Gone are the big house and all the comforts Grandma had provided them for many years. From what I've heard through distant relatives, they rent a small apartment and live modestly on their monthly Social Security checks. Charles hasn't spoken to me since that day. He and his family moved to Texas to start over. Adrian, once the golden grandson, is now just a distant memory from the past. At first, I felt slightly sad when thinking about the family that had fallen apart. Childhood memories, even the ones shaped by favoritism, were still part of me. But eventually, I came to realize that my life now should revolve only around my wife, my son Logan, and my grandmother. We visit Grandma regularly on weekends. She's now 80, her hair whiter, her steps slower, but her mind is still sharp and her spirit joyful. Logan always gets excited to see his great-grandmother, and she dotes on him endlessly. I hope she'll be with us for many more years so that Logan can treasure even more memories with this incredible woman. These days, life feels joyful every single day, especially now that we're about to welcome a new little angel. Paisley is 8 months pregnant, her belly round and beautiful, and Logan never stops talking to the baby inside. He often says, "Hey baby, I'll teach you how to play Legos and how to draw." At night, I feel fortunate when the three of us are curled up on the sofa watching a movie. Paisley resting her head on my shoulder, Logan asleep in my lap. This is the happiness I've been searching for all these years. Today, I share this story not to brag about what I have now, but in hopes that anyone who's ever gone through what I did, being mistreated, overlooked, or hurt by their own family, knows that they are not alone. And more importantly, they have the right to protect themselves. Never accept injustice just because it comes from family. Your children deserve to be loved equally. Set boundaries if you've tried to speak up and no one listened. Sometimes distancing yourself from toxic people, even if they're related by blood, is how you protect your own home. You don't owe anyone the right to hurt you just because they share your DNA. And just 1 day ago, I got a call from a distant relative. My parents are now living near him in Phoenix. He called to scold me. He said I was the reason our family fell apart. Do you think I'm the reason my family broke apart? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want your perspective. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Take care, and see you in the following story. What would you do if one day, the cat who'd been with you for years was thrown from a height of 13 feet onto the floor by your 6-year-old niece? I've been in that situation, and when it happened, my whole family chose silence. To protect my cat, I had to teach them a lesson. Let's follow the story. I'll tell you why my niece did something so cruel, and how I made them face the consequences of their actions. Hello everyone, my name is Logan Whitaker. I'm 24 years old and currently living in Bakersfield, California, a quiet town tucked away in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, where most folks still think of pets as just animals, not as part of the family. I own a little shop called Whisker and Tail. We specialize in pet care and sell products for animals. The shop sits at the end of a small street on the edge of town. Above it is a loft apartment where I live. It's a simple space, but cozy enough for me and Simba, my old tabby cat, to share quiet, peaceful mornings. My days start early. I usually wake up to the soft, breeze-like sound of Simba's paws gliding across the wooden floor, followed by the gentle nudge of his head against my hand, as if to say, time to start the day. While I make coffee in the tiny kitchen, he curls up on the windowsill, basking in a narrow beam of sunlight that slips through the aged white curtains. Moments like that, simple as they are, fill me with a sense of completeness that nothing else ever could. To most people, a cat is just a pet, but to me, Simba is family. He's been my companion, my quiet refuge through college, when I was living alone in a cramped room, working part-time at a bookstore, and dreaming of a future where I could finally stand on my own 2 feet. I used to believe that as long as I could hold on to the steady, simple life filled with Simba's presence, I'd never have to feel lost again. But everything changed 2 Thanksgivings ago, on what seemed like an ordinary evening at my parents' old house on the east side of Bakersfield. It wasn't some huge, unforgettable disaster. But for me, what happened that night left a crack. One that, even years later, I haven't been able to mend. That night, I nearly lost Simba. And worse, I started to lose the people I'd always believed would stand by me, no matter what. I still remember that night vividly. A chilly evening in late November, right on Thanksgiving. My whole family had gathered in the house where I grew up. The air was warm and energetic, laughter echoing through the rooms like a familiar tune that returns each holiday season. I had come home for Thanksgiving with Simba. When we entered my old bedroom, he leapt onto the chair by the window and curled up in a blanket, as if he'd never left this place. To Simba, that house wasn't unfamiliar. For years, every time I visited home, I brought him along. He'd sat in my Mom Elaine's lap while she read the paper, and my dad Douglas used to sneak him treats under the dinner table. In his quiet way, Simba had become just as much a part of the family as I was. That Thanksgiving, my sister Heather and her family joined us, too. Her husband Mark and their daughter Emily came with her. She was the first grandchild in the family, so it wasn't hard to guess how much love was poured into her. All afternoon, Emily ran around the house in a red velvet dress and white tights, dragging a teddy bear almost as big as she was. People chuckled as she sang loudly in the living room or swung from the staircase railing like a tiny performer on stage. Heather had married relatively young but struggled for nearly 5 years to get pregnant. By the time Emily was born, she was almost 27, and since Emily was their only child, she naturally became the center of everyone's world. Heather and Mark loved her in the way some might call unconditionally indulgent. Maybe that kind of love helped shape Emily's defiant streak, which no one wanted to admit was there. As for me, I've never been the most patient person with kids. On previous visits, I'd had to speak to Emily when she wandered into my room to grab books or messed up wooden models I'd spent weeks putting together. I never raised my voice, I just tried to teach her where the boundaries were gently. But in her distant eyes and the occasional cold glance after being corrected, I could sense the tension building between us. Still, I believed kids had their way of growing. Sometimes that pushback is part of how they learn to understand the world. What I didn't know was that my small attempts to guide her, those simple reminders, would become the spark behind something that, even now, tightens my chest when I think about it. After Thanksgiving dinner filled with turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie, everyone chatted in the living room. My dad opened a bottle of wine, and my mom brought out a big fruit tray. Heather and Mark settled into the couch while I quietly stepped into the kitchen to grab more water for everyone. But when I returned, something felt off. Emily was no longer in the room. At first, I figured she must have run out to the backyard or gone to play in one of the bedrooms. But as I walked closer to the stairs, a strange feeling tightened in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but something told me to slow down. When I looked up, I saw Emily standing on the upper floor by the railing. She was holding Simba tightly in her arms. His striped fur looked tense. His legs stretched stiffly as his body was pressed against hers. What sent a chill down my spine wasn't the act itself but Emily's face. Blank, emotionless, and before I could react, the worst happened. Still wearing that same flat expression, Emily raised Simba above her head with both hands, then threw him down from over 13 feet high. I lunged forward, throwing myself toward the bottom of the stairs in a desperate attempt to catch him. I managed to grab Simba mid-fall, but the impact knocked us hard onto the bottom steps. Simba let out a sharp, painful cry as I clutched him tightly, my knees slamming into the cold wooden floor. In that moment, I heard my mom scream. A chair crashed to the ground, and the sound of footsteps racing toward the staircase. But somehow it all faded, like the house had gone silent instantly. I couldn't distinguish who was shouting my name or running toward me. All I could hear was my heartbeat, loud, ragged, desperate, as if it were trying to hold on to something slipping through my fingers. And when I looked up under the dim light falling from the ceiling, I still saw Emily standing there, looking down with cold eyes. No sign of panic, not a hint of remorse. A few seconds after the fall, still curled up on the cold tile floor, I held Simba tightly in my arms out of sheer reflex. My left arm throbbed, my right shoulder was numb from the impact, but I didn't care about my own body. The only thing that consumed me was the trembling I felt through my fingertips. My cat was terrified. Still cradling him close, I gently checked each of his legs, ran my hand down his spine, and pressed lightly around his chest. No signs of broken bones, but his breathing was rapid, his ears pinned back, and his whole body was curled in on itself like he'd just escaped the claws of some invisible predator. Seeing Simba so afraid, I wanted to curl up too, to find some quiet corner and hide from the cold slowly spreading from the inside out. Just then, I heard the sound of small footsteps coming from the staircase. Steady, unhurried, unapologetic. I looked up. Emily was coming down the stairs, step by step, calmly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her face was expressionless, her pace relaxed, as if she were returning to the dinner table after washing her hands, not walking away from having thrown a living creature from over 13 feet in the air. In that moment, my emotions broke free. I yelled, "Emily, what did you do?" Without flinching, without hesitation. In a voice so calm it made my blood run cold, Emily replied, "I gave it some kibble. It didn't eat it and tried to scratch me, so I punished it." Hearing those words from a 6-year-old's mouth, I couldn't hold back anymore. I raised my head, looked straight at her, and with a voice hoarse from fury, I nearly growled each word. "Who taught you that?" I didn't have to shout. Every syllable carried the anger that was about to explode from my chest. After my question, she blinked once, then said in the same flat tone, "Mom says if you don't fight back, people will bully you your whole life." When she said that, it felt like someone reached into my chest and squeezed. Not painful, just suffocating. Seconds later, I turned to look at Heather. She was standing nearby. She didn't say a word, didn't step forward to check on me. Her head lowered, her fingers twisted together like she wanted the moment to pass quickly. Standing just behind her, Mark gave a slight shake of his head. His eyes met mine with a look of clear annoyance, like I was the one blowing things out of proportion over something that didn't matter. Then, with a strange calmness, my mother walked over. Seeing me still clutching Simba, she asked in a light voice, as if nothing severe had just happened, "Are you okay? Is Simba hurt?" I didn't answer. I just gently lifted Simba closer so she could see him. After a few seconds of looking him over, she spoke with a tone of relief. "He's fine. That's all that matters." That sentence hit my ears like a final verdict. Casual, unquestioning, and without a single word directed at the child who caused it all. In that moment, I held Simba even tighter. His fur was still damp with sweat, and my heart froze. I realized a line was blurred, between love and enabling, between family and complicit silence. And right there, in the house I once believed was the safest place in the world, I felt like an outsider, more alone than I'd ever been. With the pain in my shoulder still pulsing, all I could do was sit there, holding Simba tightly in my arms. Since I was 19, he had been with me for over 3 years, and I decided to leave home and start my own life. That year, I didn't go out of anger or conflict. I left because I needed a quiet space to figure out who I was. Simba was the one presence I felt I could trust completely in my first apartment, barely over 200 square feet. Every time I came home after a long day, I knew there'd always be eyes waiting for me at the window, a soft meow like a sigh, and a quiet, warm presence that filled the room without a single word. The loneliness of living on my own slowly faded from the moment Simba came into my life. Everything felt lighter, even on the most exhausting days. And yet, right in front of the people I loved most, I had almost lost the one companion I loved more than anything else, in a way I could have never imagined. Still catching my breath, I could feel a heat building in my chest. Sharp, burning, impossible to contain. I looked around the room, hoping anyone would say something about what had happened. But no one did. The silence in the room pressed against me like a wall. My every breath felt like a challenge. Like I wasn't just hurting, I was being tested. My legs were still shaky from the fall, so I stood, trying to keep my voice from cracking with rage. I spoke clearly. "This isn't a joke. This is a life. What's wrong with all of you? How can you sit there and say nothing?" My words dropped into the room like a stone. No one responded, but I saw the signs. My mother's eyes darted away, Mark's scowl deepened, and my sister's face flushed red, not with shame, but with anger. Then, with a voice shrill enough to drown out reason, Heather shouted, "She's just a kid. What the hell is wrong with you? Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Mark jumped in right after, his tone hard. "She's 6. What the hell are you blowing this up for?" As the last word left his mouth, I turned toward him, my lips pressed into a tight line. My heart pounded not from rage, but from shock. Complete shock. I wasn't alone in this house. I was out of place. Before I could speak again, I heard my mother's voice behind me, soft, but sharp enough to cut. "You're always too sensitive. Just let it go if no one's hurt." That sentence didn't hit me like a slap. It was worse. It made me feel like I no longer existed in their eyes. Like my pain, my voice, even my presence, didn't register anymore. After everything they had just said, I looked at each one, hoping someone might say something that made sense. That someone might stand on the side of what's right. But all I saw was indifference, or worse, defensiveness. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I looked around and asked, "So you're all just going to cover for this? A child just threw a cat down the stairs. You don't see anything wrong with that?" I hadn't even finished the sentence when Heather cut in, screaming as if I had just insulted her to the core. "Don't you dare preach to us!" At her words, something in me shut down. I froze. Then, without even thinking, I took a step back. My hand still gripped Simba. My breathing grew heavier. I couldn't tell what hurt more, my sister's words or the cold, mocking smirk on the face of a first grader hiding behind her mother, just visible enough for me to see clearly. In that moment, I lifted my head, and I no longer believed I was standing in the house where I grew up. Then, something settled deep inside me. A voice, quiet but steady, rising from somewhere I couldn't ignore. "If no one else is going to speak up, I have to be the first." In the thick, suffocating air of that room, where no one dared to speak the truth, where every glance either avoided mine or looked at me like I was the problem, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. Still clutching Simba in my arms, with a voice calm in a way that even surprised me, I looked each family member in the eye and said clearly, "I'm reporting this to Animal Control and the Child Psychology Center. This is behavior that needs intervention." When those words left my mouth, a furious scream cut through the room, making everyone flinch. Heather's eyes burned with rage as she practically shouted in my face, "Are you out of your damn mind, Logan?" Before I could respond, Mark stepped toward me, face flushed deep red, his fists clenched so tight they shook. His voice came out low and sharp, nothing like the calm brother-in-law I once knew, as he threatened, "If you report this, I won't let it slide. Emily is the most important thing in my life." I didn't flinch. His words landed like a block of ice inside me, not because of the threat, but because of the blindness behind it. He looked me straight in the eye and defended an act of cruelty under the name of love. And what hurt even more was that I had once believed in the man standing before me. I had once trusted that he would be level-headed enough to know the difference between right and wrong. But it didn't stop there. From behind me, my mother's voice rose, shaking with anger. "You're tearing this family apart, Logan. I turned back toward her just as she finished speaking. Looking straight into her eyes, I answered, not loudly, but with absolute certainty. No, it's the silence that's tearing this family apart. Everything went still after that final sentence, like a challenge in the room's heart. But this time, the silence didn't come from hesitation. It came from the fact that everyone had already crossed a line. A place where truth had been buried under denial. A place where no one asked about the cat in my arms, or what had just happened. They weren't defending a pet. They were defending a child, at all costs, no matter how wrong she had been. And then, just as the tension reached a point beyond saving, a loud crash came from behind. The sound of glass hitting the tile floor, shattering into pieces. I spun around, startled. Behind the display cabinet, a glass trophy had fallen and shattered on the tile floor. Shards were scattered everywhere. And when I saw the face of the person standing closest to it, my heart clenched. Because at that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one who saw this was wrong. The sharp sound of glass shattering rang out from the display cabinet, and everyone in the room flinched. I looked down at the floor just seconds after the impact. Scattered at my father's feet were shards of broken glass. Among the wreckage, I could still make out the faint inscription left on the base of the fallen trophy. President's Volunteer Service Award Heather Simmons, age 17. For a few moments, no one said a word. The entire room felt frozen in the weight of what had just happened. Then, wide-eyed and stunned, Heather screamed again. "What the hell are you doing, Dad?" My father stood motionless, his arms hanging at his sides. The calm expression I had always known was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice raspy but firm. "You think you still deserve that award?" His words hit Heather like a blow. Her breath shortened, her hands trembled, but she still snapped back. "What did I do wrong? I'm just protecting my daughter." That's when my father turned to face her completely. His eyes cutting through her like they could see everything she'd ever tried to hide. He said, "Wrong? You don't think you're wrong? You're raising a child who reflects the same mistakes you've never dared to face. 10 years ago, I found your abortion papers in the drawer of your desk." The second he said it, it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Heather stood frozen, speechless. Mark turned slowly to look at his wife, his face blank, stunned. Elaine jumped to her feet and rushed to cover Emily's ears, pulling the little girl into her arms. In the center of the chaos, my father continued, his voice deeper now, weighed down. "I stayed quiet because I thought you'd grow. I believed you'd become better if I didn't bring it up. But no, you didn't change. You just passed on the worst parts of yourself to your child." Mark no longer resembled the composed man I once knew. He looked at Heather, then away, as if he no longer knew how to face her or himself. What he had just heard seemed to shake the foundation of his beliefs about his family. Heather lowered her head at my father's words. Tears streamed down her face. Her voice cracked and broke as she choked out, "You don't have the right to bring that up now." But my father's gaze stayed steady, and this time he wasn't angry. He shook his head and spoke slowly. "Yes, I do, because I'm the one who stayed silent for 10 years. To protect your reputation and this family's." While the argument unraveled, I stood still. I didn't interrupt. I didn't take my eyes off my father. In my arms, Simba had stopped trembling. He lay quietly against my chest, eyes closed, tail gently twitching. His breathing had finally returned to a calm rhythm, soft and steady, like a breeze gliding across water. And I realized it was he who was helping me stay calm now. In a room full of accusations, confused stares, and a past suddenly dragged out into the light, I felt something inside me begin to settle. And I understood, sometimes, misplaced love can be more toxic than hate. After my father spoke, the air in the room became so heavy that no one could breathe normally. It was like something had just collapsed in the middle of the room. Not a scream, not anger, but a truth so massive that all anyone could do was stand there and watch it be bare. Heather, the woman who had just shouted in anger a few minutes ago, was now standing in the middle of the living room, clutching the edge of a chair, eyes wide and unblinking. Her face had gone pale, and her shoulders were tense. The harsh words from earlier had vanished, leaving behind a woman trying to keep her balance after being struck by something ripped from the past. Mark, the husband who had stood beside Heather for years because he believed she was strong, knew what she wanted, and lived with responsibility, was now leaning near the window frame. He didn't step forward or walk away. His eyes rested on Heather, not steady as they once were, but quiet and confused. as if his mind was rewinding all the years they had lived together, trying to find some detail that had been overlooked. And then, in that silence, it seemed he realized. The woman on the verge of collapsing in front of him was no longer the image he thought he understood. A few seconds later, as if trying to break the silence tightening around the room, Heather burst into tears. She turned toward my mother, her voice catching in her throat before breaking into a hurt-filled call. "Mom, why aren't you saying anything? Why aren't you taking my side?" That sentence didn't need to be loud. It was enough to make the whole room shift. It was a plea, not to defend herself, but a fragile hope from a daughter being pushed into a corner, hoping her mother would still cover her. My mother was still sitting in her chair. Her hands were tightly clasped together. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, not avoiding, but also not seeking anyone's gaze. There was no sign she wanted to stop anything. Only silence, and the presence of someone tired of holding the balance of this family. About a minute later, after regaining his composure, Mark took another step forward. His voice broke in pauses, like someone trying to hide the tremor inside. He asked Heather, "How long have you been hiding that from me?" Heather didn't respond to her husband's question. She collapsed beside the chair, her shoulders pulled in, her face buried in her hands. Sharp, broken breaths echoed through the room, which was now completely still. I stood where I was. I didn't move toward anyone. I looked at each face and reaction like someone watching a collapse from which no one could run. My father was still standing near the window. He didn't turn around. He just let out a long breath, then spoke again, his voice low, almost like he was talking to himself. "A family where everyone lives with secrets no longer has the shape of a family." His words sank the room even deeper. Every sound and breath pulled inward. Every look seemed to hit something that couldn't be put into words. And then, a small voice rose, soft like wind brushing against a window. Emily was still sitting close to my mother, her head resting lightly against the arm that had just covered her ears. A gesture she was already familiar with whenever the adults started saying things kids weren't supposed to hear. She looked up, her eyes wide, clear, but no longer carrying the gaze of an innocent child. In a flat voice, almost a whisper, she asked, "If my mom did something wrong, does she get punished like Simba, too, Grandma?" That question rang out like a final bell in a house already full of muffled noise. No one answered Emily when she asked a question that cut to the heart of every person in that room. But I heard it, clearly. That question didn't need an explanation. It was proof that everything the adults had tried to hide had now reached the youngest one in the family. And when no one in that room dared to speak again, I knew. There was still one person who needed to hear the whole story. While Emily was still sitting beside her grandmother, her head resting on her arm, her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her dress, as if she didn't fully understand the storm that had just swept through the room. At that moment, my father stepped forward, his eyes not looking at anyone else, a heavy gaze that had just awakened inside him. He sat down next to his granddaughter. His voice wasn't loud, but there was a weight to it that made everyone listen. "Do you know that hurting others is something you shouldn't do?" Emily looked up as soon as he finished. She stared at my father with her clear eyes, then answered slowly and clearly, "If they hurt you first, then it's not wrong." Right after she said that, I saw my father's hand clench. The knuckles showed clearly under his tense skin. He closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to swallow something rising in his chest. Then, in a lower voice, he asked again, "Who told you that?" Emily sat up straight, her eyes steady and unblinking. Her voice came out calm, like she was repeating something she had memorized. "My mom said so. She said if you're not cruel, people will walk all over you." I saw my father freeze at her answer. He was still sitting next to Emily, but his body seemed drained of warmth. In his eyes, what had just been spoken wasn't just a sentence. It was a clear sign that something had gone wrong from the very root. After a moment of silence, my father asked again, this time in a deeper tone, as if testing her. "What if I accidentally broke a toy you love? What would you do?" As soon as he finished, Emily replied in a flat voice, "I'd break the thing you love the most." Time seemed to stop in the room the moment she finished. My mother placed a hand over her mouth, tears beginning to fall. She looked at Emily, eyes wet, her gaze far away, as if she had just seen something harrowing that she no longer had the strength to stop. I gently held Simba tighter in my arms. His chest rose and fell, still breathing steadily, but my own heart was growing colder. Not out of fear of Emily, but because of what she was repeating, as a natural result of the things adults had planted into her young mind. After everything Emily said, I no longer saw a child. I saw a small mirror, reflecting the most twisted parts of the adults who thought they could keep those things hidden. She was learning to understand her small world through the cracks the grown-ups left behind, in silence. Faced with the cold words coming from the mouth of a 6-year-old child, with a way of thinking that no longer seemed to recognize the line between right and wrong, everyone in my family knew something in her had gone off course, and none of us had realized it soon enough. A few seconds later, as the heavy silence blanketed the room, my father turned to look at Mark and Heather. His voice rang out clearly, each word landing like a deliberate reminder. What do you two think about this? If she grows up believing that, what kind of life will she live? No one answered the question from the man who had spent his life teaching others to live by principles. Douglas Whitaker, my father, had been a human resources manager at a regional oil company. He wasn't a man of many words, but he lived with a clear sense of right and wrong. In his eyes, the most important thing a person could leave behind for their children wasn't money or reputation, but how they treated others when no one was watching. He was the one who taught both Heather and me to keep our promises, admit when we were wrong, and most of all, stand on the side of what's right, even if it meant being misunderstood. I remember clearly, on the night Emily was born, he looked at Heather with quiet eyes and said, "From now on, you're allowed to be tired, to be confused, but live in a way that someday, your daughter can lift her head and say, 'My mom is a good person.'" That sentence stayed with me for years. But now, standing in this room, hearing him ask his daughter that same question with a voice filled with helplessness, I understood something. Even the most explicit warnings given early on don't always stop someone from straying off the path. After my father's question, Heather turned away. She walked over and pulled Emily into her arms. She didn't offer any explanation, no defense. She just held her daughter tightly and walked out of the living room. Mark followed behind her, his steps slow, his head lowered, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of composure he had left. The room fell into silence as my sister's small family walked out. There were no more conversations, no sign of a joyful reunion. Near the display cabinet, a few shards of glass still lay scattered. The wine glasses were half full, and plates of unfinished food sat on the table. Everything that had once felt warm now lingered only as an aftertaste. I stood in the middle of that room, not fully grasping what had happened. Still stunned by the sudden departure of my sister and brother-in-law, I felt my father's gaze. He didn't say much, just let out a quiet breath and spoke calmly, "Do what you need to do." I looked up at him. His words felt like the final lock being opened inside me. When everything had already passed the point of a simple family disagreement, I knew this was no longer a matter of right or wrong between adults. This needed intervention. After everything that had just happened, I understood one thing clearly. Silence protects no one. Silence only gives room for what's broken to grow deeper. After Heather's family left, I wrapped Simba in an old knitted blanket and took him to the familiar vet clinic at the edge of town. It was the place I had always taken him for vaccinations and seasonal checkups. The vet scrutinized him, ran x-rays, and confirmed that Simba was physically safe. Just signs of trauma, heightened defensive response, and a need for rest in a quiet environment. I exhaled deeply when I heard the results. My chest was still tight, but at least I knew I hadn't been too late. Still, I understood something clearly. What waited ahead wasn't at the vet clinic. What I was about to do would redraw the boundaries within my family. And once I crossed that line, there would be no way back. The next day, I replayed the footage from the living room security camera, one that my father had installed last year after a break-in during the night. As I scrubbed through the recording, I nearly held my breath. The conversation between my father and Emily appeared clearly. There was no yelling, no coercion, just a child repeating what she had learned from adults, in a calm, chillingly steady voice. That afternoon, I submitted the video and Simba's veterinary report to the Kern County Child Protective Services and the local animal control unit. 3 days later, representatives from both agencies conducted home visits at my parents' house at the end of Marigold Street, where the incident happened, and Heather's residence in the Willow Creek neighborhood, about 4 blocks away. At both sites, they assessed the living environment, spoke individually with family members, and observed the overall atmosphere in each home. Heather reacted violently the moment she was notified of the intervention. She stormed into the coordination office with red eyes and a trembling voice, accusing me of betraying the family and calling my actions destructive. But deep down, I knew what she feared most was losing her role as a mother. Once the procedures were complete, Child Protective Services assigned an independent psychologist to evaluate Emily's behavior across 3 private sessions. She was taken to the regional therapy center without any family members accompanying her. The preliminary results arrived a week later. The report stated that Emily exhibited uncontrolled retaliatory behavior, difficulty connecting emotions with actions, and a high risk of behavioral deviation if left unaddressed. The doctor recommended placing her in a behavioral therapy program for a period of 3 to 6 months. Under professional guidance, the Department of Family Services issued a formal recommendation. But Heather resisted fiercely. She insisted her daughter was normal and that the real problem was everyone who interfered in their lives. She cried, then screamed, but nothing stopped the final decision. That day, I went with my father to the intake office of the center, as he had signed the intervention request and was required to be present during the transfer. Emily didn't fully understand what was happening, but could feel the separation. She screamed and struggled, sobbing as the staff led her to the car. She turned back to all of us and cried out, "I'm not going. I didn't do anything wrong. You all hate me." Her cries echoed down the hallway, each one cutting deep. I stood still, holding the case file tightly to my chest. Beside me, my father stared at the slowly closing door, unmoving. Mark stood farther back. As the vehicle pulled away from the gate, I saw him cry. He didn't hide it or turn away. The tear rolled down his chin quietly, like a weight finally slipping off after being carried for too long. In the end, my father signed the confirmation form. He affirmed that he was a witness and the person who had directly requested Emily's placement in therapy. And in that moment, watching him sign his name on that document, I'll never forget the look in his eyes as we left the office. He didn't say a word, but his gaze told me everything. That he had done what needed to be done, and that he hoped I would keep standing for what's right, no matter what. And maybe, for the first time, I saw the system side with what was right. Not to punish anyone, but to preserve a piece of humanity quietly unraveling through time and silence. Since the day Emily was taken away, kicking, screaming, with her parents' late and helpless tears trailing behind her, I had no idea what had happened inside my sister's home. I didn't know if they were still speaking to each other or how many arguments had erupted since. All I knew was that while Emily was still undergoing psychological treatment at the Tulare County facility, that family was quietly falling apart in a way none of us had ever wanted to see. One weekend afternoon, I stopped by to visit my dad. I had just set Simba down on his small bed in the living room when the doorbell rang. Rapid, urgent. My mom went to open the door, and seconds later, a familiar voice erupted through the house, freezing us in place. My sister, Heather, stood at the door, her face flushed, her eyes wild with panic and rage. Without greeting anyone, she stormed straight into the living room and shouted, "Logan, you're the one who destroyed this family." Before I could react, Heather turned to our father, pointing directly at him, her voice cracking through tears. "He's divorcing me because of you. Because of you. My poor daughter is stuck in some strange place with no one she knows, no one who loves her." The moment the words left her mouth, my mom grabbed her daughter's shoulders. Her voice trembled like a plea. "Stop it. That's enough." But Heather didn't seem to hear anything anymore. She shoved my mom's hands away and kept screaming, "If you hadn't brought up the past, if Logan hadn't blown everything out of proportion over a damn cat, none of this would have happened. Is that what you all wanted? To see me lose everything?" My fists clenched at her words, my whole body burning. But it wasn't the words that hit me. It was how she refused to take responsibility for anything, like nothing that had happened was her fault. Before I could speak, my father stepped forward. He stood in front of Heather. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't warn her. He raised his hand and slapped her across the cheek. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to bring the entire room to a standstill. Heather took a step back, stunned. Not from the force, but from the fact that the man who had always been gentle with his children had just hit her. Her expression flickered from shock to disbelief. And my father, his face full of anger and helplessness, looked like, in over 30 years of being a father, this was the first time he had no other way to act. After a few seconds of silence, he looked her straight in the eye. His voice was slow and firm. "Get out. If you say one more word to disgrace this family, you are no longer a part of it today." That sentence landed like a final verdict. No one came to her defense. No one argued. I knew Heather still believed that somehow she'd be forgiven. But after that day, everything broke. Clearly, silently. just like how she walked out of the house that afternoon. And today marks exactly 2 years since it all happened. After a long period of therapy, Emily returned to live with my sister. Mark is no longer there. After finalizing the divorce, he left a silence that no one in the family mentions anymore. The two now live in a small apartment just a few steps from my parents' house. Maybe that's how my sister chose to face her mistakes. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to remind herself daily that there's still something left to make right. Emily is now 8. She's no longer the child hiding in the room's corner with a vacant stare. With the help of the therapists and teachers my father reached out to, she has changed, little by little, enough for everyone in the family to see that what once went off course can be gently steered back if the grown-ups have enough patience. One afternoon, 6 months after she came home, I received a small envelope that my father handed me. Inside was a packet of cat treats and a sheet of notebook paper. In the letter, Emily writes that she has saved up her own money to buy a gift for Simba. She wanted to say sorry, and wrote that if she ever had the chance, she hoped to apologize to Simba in person, to make amends. I read that letter over and over, not just for what it said, but because I could feel something beginning to grow again inside that child. A kind of genuine emotion, not perfect but real, and slowly maturing. As for Simba, he's still here, 2 years older now. He no longer leaps around every morning like he used to. These days, he mostly lies on the windowsill, eyes half closed in the sunlight. He's calmer now, slower, but still the one companion who stayed by my side while everything else unraveled. My parents don't bring up the past anymore, but in the way they look at Emily, I see something softer. As if, even without words, they're quietly hoping this family can somehow be stitched back together, one small act at a time. Maybe that's the most human wish any parent can hold on to. As for me, after graduating, I used the savings I'd built up from years of part-time work and a small bit of help from my parents to open Whisker and Tail. It's a space I created for the ones who've been left behind, for people trying to rebuild trust, and for myself, the person who almost lost everything just for holding on to something others thought was small. If there's anything I want to leave behind from the story, maybe it's this. Every living being that shows up in this world carries within them the chance to be loved. Whether it's a child still learning how to be kind, or a small cat thrown from a staircase inside a house that should have felt warm. What they need isn't perfection. They need someone patient enough to stay when they're most fragile, and kind enough not to leave when they lose their way. And that's where my story ends. Before I go, I want to ask you one thing. Was I wrong for speaking up to protect a voiceless creature, even if it meant breaking apart a family? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear them. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it. Thank you and see you next time.